The sentence landed in the room and just sat there. "I think you've peaked, Dana." Richard Vail said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. His hands were folded over a leather portfolio that cost more than my first car, and the smell of burnt coffee from the executive floor kitchenette drifted under the conference room door. Peaked. At 52. I remember staring at the yellow legal pad in front of me because I knew if I looked directly at him too long, I might accidentally laugh. And that would have made things awkward for everyone. Behind Richard, the wall-mounted screen still showed my annual review slide deck. Revenue growth, 18%. Client retention, 96%. New business pipeline, $11.4 million. Apparently, that was plateauing. He leaned back in his chair. Navy suit. No socks. One of those little details men think makes them look younger. "We're moving toward fresh energy," he said. "A more modern vision." I nodded once. Understood. Then I closed my notebook, stood up, and watched 3 vice presidents suddenly become fascinated with the table grain. That was Friday morning. By Monday afternoon, 6 people had agreed to leave with me. And Richard still thought he'd won. My name is Dana Mercer. I was Senior Director of Brand Strategy at Hawthorne Creative Group for 17 years. Not worked there. Built there. There's a difference. When I joined Hawthorne in 2008, the agency occupied half a floor above a bank in downtown Chicago and had exactly 23 employees, 1 regional healthcare client, and a website that looked like it had been assembled during a power outage. By the time Richard told me I'd peaked, we had 114 employees across 3 states and annual billings just over $74 million. I built most of the systems that made that growth possible. Not alone. Nobody does anything alone in an agency. But I was the person who turned chaos into something scalable. I created the Horizon Retention Protocol in 2014 after we lost 2 automotive clients in 1 quarter because account teams weren't escalating performance issues fast enough. Horizon was simple. Mandatory escalation checkpoints every 14 days, client sentiment tracking, revenue risk scoring. Nothing glamorous. But it reduced account losses by 41% in 18 months. Then there was Beacon. Beacon started as a spreadsheet I built on a Sunday night at my kitchen table because I got tired of executives making staffing decisions based on whoever talked loudest in meetings. Beacon tracked campaign profitability, team utilization, revision cycles, overtime exposure, and client response times. It eventually became the operational backbone for every major account in the company. Richard presented it at conferences like he'd invented it himself. I let him. That's another thing people misunderstand about competent women in corporate environments. We notice everything. We simply learn which battles are worth the paperwork. Over 17 years, I brought in $38 million in direct client revenue. I led the recovery campaign that saved our largest retail account after a product recall nearly destroyed them publicly. I negotiated the Northwestern Mutual expansion deal that increased annual billings by 230% in under 2 years. I also missed my father's final surgery consultation because a pharmaceutical client threatened to walk during a contract renewal. Richard sent flowers to the funeral. White lilies. Generic card. Appreciate your dedication. That was him exactly. Efficient enough to appear human. The irony was that Richard wasn't even the founder. His father was. Martin Vail started Hawthorne Creative in 1991. Smart man. Gruff. Smoked cigars on the loading dock because his wife wouldn't let him do it at home. He understood clients, respected operations people, and once told me, the loudest person in the room is usually covering for something. Then he retired. And his son inherited the building, the accounts, and, unfortunately, authority. Richard Vail was 38 when he became CEO. He looked like every man who says circle back 6 times a day. Perfect white teeth. Expensive watches. Hairline managed aggressively by modern medicine. He also had the attention span of a Labrador near a tennis ball. The first sign of trouble came during a quarterly leadership meeting 3 months after he took over. We were reviewing campaign performance for a regional grocery chain. I explained that customer acquisition costs had risen 14% because digital ad saturation in the Midwest market was pushing bidding prices higher. Richard nodded thoughtfully. So, what if we pivot the KPI ecosystem toward more viral synergy? Silence. Not confused silence. Exhausted silence. Across the table, Marcus Hill from Analytics physically stopped typing. Richard kept going. If engagement's the bottleneck, shouldn't we just optimize the algorithmic bandwidth on the consumer funnel? Now, I want to be clear about something. Corporate jargon isn't automatically stupidity. Every industry has shorthand. But Richard spoke the way a teenager bluffs through a book report for a novel he didn't read. Words near each other. No actual meaning. I said carefully, the issue isn't engagement. The issue is acquisition cost inflation. He smiled at me the way men smile when they think they're explaining technology to their mothers. Right. But strategically. Marcus looked down so he wouldn't laugh. After the meeting, he followed me into the hallway. What the hell is algorithmic bandwidth? He whispered. No idea, I said. Should I track it? Only if you can invoice it. That became the pattern. Richard would skim trend reports on flights, absorb half the terminology, then march into meetings determined to sound visionary. One week, he became obsessed with disruptive storytelling architecture. The next week, it was consumer intimacy scaling. He once told a client their campaign needed more omni-channel emotionality. The client actually asked me afterward if he was having a stroke. But incompetence alone doesn't destroy companies. Protected incompetence does. Because nobody corrected him. Nobody except me occasionally, and even then, carefully. The executives adapted instead. Meetings became translation exercises. Richard would speak in inspirational LinkedIn captions while the rest of us quietly interpreted what operational decisions still needed to happen. Then came Tyler. Every corporate disaster eventually comes with a Tyler. Tyler Baines was 31 years old, freshly imported from a failed startup in Austin where he'd apparently been head of culture and growth innovation, which I eventually discovered meant posting motivational quotes on Slack and organizing tequila tastings. Richard hired him as vice president of creative strategy. No agency experience. None. His suits were aggressively expensive, but fit like he'd borrowed them from a taller cousin. He wore white sneakers with everything. He interrupted people constantly and referred to clients by first names after meeting them once. During his first executive presentation, he mispronounced Nielsen. Twice. Nielsen data indicates we're under-indexing Gen Z conversion momentum, he announced confidently. Lena Ortiz from media planning slowly removed her glasses. Nobody corrected him. Tyler clicked to the next slide. A campaign proposal I'd personally rejected 2 months earlier because consumer testing showed terrible recall rates. He presented it like a revolutionary concept. Richard loved it. This, Richard said, pointing at Tyler like he'd discovered electricity, is exactly the kind of fresh thinking we need. Fresh thinking. The campaign lost $480,000 in 6 weeks. Tyler blamed market resistance. Of course he did. He also developed a habit that told me everything I needed to know about him. Whenever junior employees spoke in meetings, he'd glance at his phone while they talked. But the second a senior executive repeated the same idea 5 minutes later, Tyler would sit forward and say, exactly. People notice those things. Especially smart people lower on the ladder. One afternoon, I walked into conference room after a client call and found Sophie Chen sitting alone at the table staring at printed campaign revisions. Sophie was one of the best senior copywriters I'd ever managed. Quiet. Razor sharp. The kind of person who could hear one bad sentence and instantly know why an entire campaign felt wrong. She looked tired. Everything okay? I asked. Sophie hesitated. Then she slid a marked-up draft across the table. Tyler's revisions. He'd replaced half her copy with phrases like, unlock your best self journey, and elevate the authenticity experience. I read 2 pages. Did he actually write this? She nodded. He said my version lacked disruption energy. I handed the pages back. It lacks grammar. That made her laugh harder than I expected. Then she stopped laughing almost immediately. He presented my original concepts to Richard yesterday, she said quietly. Didn't mention my name once. There it was. Not the mistake. The pattern. I started noticing similar conversations everywhere after that. Marcus in analytics staying late redoing projections because Tyler kept promising impossible delivery timelines to clients. Lena quietly removing Tyler's unsupported demographic claims from presentations before legal compliance reviews. Account managers building backup schedules because Richard kept approving last-minute strategy pivots during golf outings with clients. Good employees don't complain dramatically when companies start failing. They compensate silently. At first, the annual review happened 6 months later in conference room Ash on the 14th floor. Cold room. Aggressive air conditioning. The kind that makes everyone slightly uncomfortable so meetings end faster. Richard sat across from me with Melissa Dunn from HR, beside him holding a pen she never used. Melissa wouldn't look at me. That told me everything before the meeting even started. Richard opened with compliments first. They always do. Your operational consistency has been invaluable. Operational consistency. Interesting phrase. Like I was an appliance. He flipped through the review packet. Nobody questions your contributions, Dana. Translation. Someone absolutely was. Then came the pause. Corporate pauses are their own language. There's the promotion pause. The liability pause. The we're about to say something spineless pause. I waited. Richard folded his hands. The agency is evolving toward a younger market position. There it was. Not performance. Optics. We need leaders who reflect emerging energy. I said nothing. He kept talking because silence makes weak executives nervous. You've had an exceptional run here. Truly exceptional. But I think. He smiled carefully. I think you've plateaued. Melissa shifted in her chair. Richard continued quickly. We're restructuring the department. Tyler will assume strategic leadership responsibilities moving forward. Of course he would. The man who thought demographics were a vibe metric. I looked at the folder in front of me. 17 years reduced to 12 printed pages and a severance agreement. 4 months' salary. No non-compete. That part interested me immediately. No non-compete meant legal either forgot or deliberately omitted it. Either possibility was useful. Richard mistook my silence for defeat. You'll have full support during the transition period. Transition period. Meaning train your replacement before we erase you. I closed the folder. When does this take effect? I asked. Melissa finally spoke. We were hoping for 30 days. Of course they were. 30 days to extract every remaining piece of institutional knowledge from the aging employee before replacing her with podcast vocabulary. I nodded once. No. Richard blinked. No, my resignation is effective Monday. The room went completely still. Not dramatic still. Corporate still. The kind where people suddenly remember every email they ignored from you for 10 years. Richard recovered first. Dana, I don't think you're appreciating the strategic implications here. I am. We need continuity. I almost smiled. That word. Continuity. As if continuity was something generated automatically by software instead of exhausted middle managers who've spent years preventing disasters nobody ever hears about. Melissa finally looked at me directly. There was actual panic in her face now. Dana, she said carefully, there are several active client integrations you're overseeing personally. Yes. And Beacon administration access will remain documented. Richard straightened. Documented doesn't replace leadership. No, it doesn't. That realization hit him about 3 seconds too late. I stood up, slid the severance packet back across the table untouched, and picked up my notebook. Richard tried one last time. I'd hate for this to become emotional. That almost made me laugh. Emotional. As though he'd just watched a woman lose control instead of watching an operations executive perform a risk assessment in real time. I looked at him calmly. It isn't. Then I walked out. The hallway outside Ash felt warmer than the conference room. Phones ringing. Printers humming. Somebody laughing near the kitchen. Normal office sounds. Which was strange, considering the company had just removed the structural beam holding up half the building. People avoided eye contact as I crossed the floor. Except Marcus. He stood when I passed analytics. You okay? He asked quietly. Fine. He studied my face for a second. Then he said the most honest thing anyone had said all day. They have no idea what they just did. No, I said. They don't. What Richard didn't know was that I'd spent the previous 18 months preparing for exactly this outcome. Not because I expected to be fired. Because competent women in corporate leadership eventually learn a specific survival skill, always maintain an exit strategy. Especially after 50. Age changes the room before anyone admits it does. You notice younger executives repeating your ideas louder. Recruiters stop calling as often. Men with less experience begin explaining your own department back to you during meetings. So I prepared quietly. In January of the previous year, after Richard promoted Tyler despite catastrophic campaign losses, I started organizing every operational system I personally managed. Not hiding information. Not sabotaging anything. Documenting reality. There's a difference. I built transition binders for all major accounts. Client communication histories. Vendor escalation procedures. Renewal calendars. Risk matrices. Staffing models. Password protocols routed through secure credential systems. Everything ethical. Everything professional. But documentation only works if someone competent can interpret it. And most of Hawthorne's institutional knowledge existed inside conversations, relationships, and pattern recognition developed over years. Beacon wasn't just software. It was judgment. For example, the system flagged abnormal revision patterns before clients became unhappy. But only experienced account leads understood which patterns signaled budget frustration versus leadership instability versus legal concern. I knew because I'd seen every version before. I also knew which clients hated being over-contacted, which procurement officers stalled contracts intentionally for leverage, which creative directors panicked under pressure, and which CFOs needed 3 days before responding to pricing changes. That information doesn't live in spreadsheets. It lives in people. Specifically, in the people Richard kept insulting. 3 weeks before my review, Tyler had held a future vision alignment session in the main conference space. God help me, that was the actual title. He stood in front of 40 employees wearing a $1,200 blazer and explained that the agency needed less legacy thinking and more adaptive creator energy. Legacy thinking. Interesting way to describe the employees responsible for paying everyone's mortgages. He announced mandatory weekend brainstorming retreats starting the following quarter. Unpaid, naturally. I watched the room while he talked. That's something leadership teaches you after enough years. Don't watch the speaker. Watch the listeners. Sophie stopped taking notes halfway through. Marcus leaned back with his arms crossed. Lena stared at the table. Nobody challenged Tyler directly because smart employees rarely waste energy arguing with protected people. They disengage instead. Quietly. That meeting told me something important. If I ever left, I wouldn't leave alone. Not because I recruited anyone. Because miserable, competent people eventually follow stability. So the Monday after my resignation, instead of showing up to Hawthorne, I rented a small furnished office suite above a law firm in River North with terrible lighting and exactly 2 functioning conference chairs. The sign in the lobby still had the previous tenant listed, Lakeshore Dental Consulting. Perfect. Cheap. Anonymous. I incorporated Mercer Stratagem within 48 hours. Boutique brand and operational strategy consultancy. Just me initially. At least on paper. The first person who called wasn't a client. It was Marcus. He sounded exhausted. Dana, he said, Tyler just promised a retail client a full market repositioning in 12 days. 12. He keeps calling it an agile compression sprint. I closed my eyes briefly. And Richard thinks it's innovative. Of course he did. Marcus lowered his voice. Listen, hypothetically, if someone were considering leaving. I smiled for the first time in days. Hypothetically, I said, I'd recommend not making emotional decisions. He laughed once. Then quietly. Everything feels different without you here. That wasn't sentimentality. That was systems failure beginning. By Wednesday morning, the first real crack appeared. Hawthorne missed a pharmaceutical compliance deadline tied to a regional campaign rollout worth $2.3 million in annual billings. Not because anyone forgot. Because the compliance escalation process had always run through me unofficially after legal review. I knew which attorney answered emails after hours. which forms required duplicate submission formatting, which reviewer rejected incomplete metadata fields automatically. Small details. Expensive details. Without the escalation sequence, the campaign stalled 72 hours before launch. The client noticed immediately. At 7:14 p.m., my phone lit up with Richard's name. I let it ring. Then ring again. Then voicemail. Dana, hi. Quick question regarding the PharmaWest approval workflow. Melissa says documentation may be archived under an older compliance structure. If you could just give us a quick call back tonight, we'd appreciate it. Interesting. An hour later, he called again. This time Tyler left the voicemail. Dana, hey. Quick alignment issue. We just need clarification on some back-end procedural architecture regarding client deployment sequencing. Translation. They had no idea what they were doing. I deleted the voicemail. The second problem hit Thursday morning. Bennett Outdoor Retail, one of Hawthorne's largest accounts. They requested revised Q3 projections using Beacon's forecasting model. Except nobody remaining actually understood how the forecasting variables interacted because I'd built the override logic manually over 9 years based on seasonal purchasing behaviors. Tyler apparently tried presenting numbers anyway. Bad decision. Very bad. Because Bennett's CFO noticed inconsistencies during the call and asked a simple follow-up question Tyler couldn't answer. Marcus texted me at 11:42 a.m. This is bad. 5 minutes later another message arrived. Richard screaming in glass conference. Never seen him like this. Then, Bennett suspended campaign expansion pending review. I stared at the screen for a moment. Not happy. Not vindicated. Just unsurprised. At 3:16 p.m., Sophie called. Not texted. Called. That mattered. I answered immediately. There was noise behind her. Office chatter. A door shutting somewhere. You busy? She asked. Not particularly. Long pause. Then quietly. It's falling apart here. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my tiny office suite. Bare walls. Fold-out desk. Half-dead plant somebody abandoned before I rented the place. Peaceful. What happened? I asked. Tyler fired an account manager this morning for questioning timeline estimates during a client call. Of course he did. And Richard. He backed him publicly. She hesitated. 3 people started updating resumes before lunch. I could hear exhaustion in her voice now. The specific exhaustion good employees develop when they realize leadership is protecting ego instead of competence. Then Sophie said something that made me sit forward. Dana. Bennett asked if you left voluntarily. That was fast. Clients always know before executives think they do. And? I asked. We didn't answer right away. She exhaled slowly. Richard took over the call personally. I already knew how that conversation went. Too defensive. Too polished. Too immediate. The behavior of a man trying to control a narrative before understanding whether one exists. Sophie lowered her voice. I don't think they believed him. Outside my office window, Chicago traffic crawled through late afternoon rain. Horns. Brake lights. Gray sky settling over the river. My phone buzzed again. Marcus. You should probably turn on CNBC tomorrow morning. No explanation. Just that. And for the first time since walking out of conference room Ash, I realized Richard still didn't understand the actual problem. He thought he'd lost an employee. He hadn't. He'd lost the people everyone else trusted when things went wrong. And by the time he figured that out, it was already too late. By the end of the second week, people had stopped calling it a transition. Now they were calling it a situation. Corporate language evolves fast under pressure. First it's restructuring. Then operational disruption. Then strategic instability. Eventually someone in finance starts using phrases like exposure risk, and suddenly everybody remembers where the exits are. Marcus kept me updated without meaning to. He'd text things at midnight after 14-hour days. Tyler just approved 3 campaigns without legal review. Richard moved the Bennett presentation up 48 hours because he thinks confidence fixes math. Half the creative team is interviewing elsewhere. The messages weren't dramatic. That made them worse. People only become calm like that after exhaustion replaces panic. A week after my resignation, Hawthorne lost the Bennett Outdoor Expansion account officially. $6.8 million gone. Not because of one mistake. Because of accumulation. Tyler had promised delivery timelines the operations team couldn't meet. Richard kept overriding staffing warnings because he thought caution looked weak in front of clients. Then finance discovered campaign margin projections were inflated by almost 19% because Beacon's forecasting logic had been manually bypassed by someone who didn't understand how seasonal retail variables interacted. That someone was Tyler. Apparently, he decided the system was overcomplicating agility. Nothing terrifies executives faster than discovering the boring systems they mocked were the only things preventing catastrophe. The Bennett call happened on a Thursday morning. I know because Marcus sent me a single sentence afterward. You would have hated this. Later that night he finally explained. Richard had insisted on personally salvaging the relationship through a live video conference with Bennett's executive board. Tyler joined him from the main presentation room on the 14th floor. According to Marcus, it started badly and somehow got worse from there. Richard opened with what he probably believed was reassurance. We're aggressively modernizing our strategic infrastructure. The Bennett CFO asked a straightforward question. Can you explain why projected Q3 conversion figures differ from the reporting methodology your agency used for the last 4 years? Silence. Then Tyler jumped in. We've pivoted toward a more adaptive forecasting philosophy. A philosophy. Not data. A philosophy. The CFO asked again. Are these numbers accurate? Tyler started talking about consumer fluidity metrics. Marcus told me one of the Bennett executives actually removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes halfway through the call like he was developing a migraine in real time. Then Richard made the mistake that finally exposed everything. He blamed me. Not directly. Cowards rarely do things directly. But he implied the forecasting inconsistencies were tied to legacy operational models built under prior leadership structures. Prior leadership structures. Interesting phrase for the woman who built the system currently preventing his company from collapsing completely. Unfortunately for Richard, Bennett's COO had worked with me for 11 years. She interrupted him immediately. Dana Mercer built the reporting framework your agency used during our most profitable expansion cycle. Marcus said the room went completely still after that. Then came the fatal question. So why exactly did you let her leave? Nobody answered quickly enough. That's the thing about truth in corporate environments. Sometimes it only takes 2 seconds of silence. Bennett terminated agency of record negotiations the next morning. The stockholder update leaked internally by lunch. By Monday, the board got involved. Not the executive committee. The actual board. People who hadn't attended operational meetings in years suddenly started requesting emergency reviews and audit summaries. Finance began pulling historical performance reports. HR quietly froze new hiring approvals. And Richard started calling me personally instead of through assistants. The first real offer came 12 days after I left. I was eating takeout salad alone in my office while reviewing incorporation paperwork when his name flashed across my screen again. This time I answered. Not because I felt generous. Because timing matters. Dana. Richard sounded tired for the first time since I'd known him. Thank you for picking up. MHM. We need to discuss a path forward. There it was. Not an apology. A path forward. Corporate men will crawl across broken glass before saying the words I was wrong. He kept talking quickly, like speed could disguise desperation. We may have underestimated the complexity of your operational oversight. May have. Interesting. What exactly are you asking for? I said. We'd like to explore bringing you back in a strategic advisory capacity. Advisory. Meaning, fix everything without actual authority so we can blame you later if it fails. I leaned back in my chair. No. Silence. Then carefully. We're prepared to discuss compensation adjustments. Still no. Richard exhaled sharply. Dana, this situation is becoming difficult to stabilize. That sentence told me more than he intended. Not difficult. Uncontrollable. I looked around my tiny office suite again. The folding desk. The humming mini refrigerator. The whiteboard I'd bought myself at Staples 2 days earlier. Peaceful. Then I thought about conference room ash. About plateaued. I don't return to places that confuse stability with stagnation, I said. Then I hung up. 3 minutes later, Marcus texted me. Did you just reject Richard personally? Yes. Long pause. Then, people are going to talk about that for years. The spiral accelerated after that. Different departments started failing in different ways because Hawthorne's real problem was never one bad executive. It was institutional arrogance. Once leadership convinced themselves experience was replaceable, they stopped listening to the people preventing disasters. Compliance issues hit first. Then staffing. Then client confidence. The healthcare division missed 2 regulatory review checkpoints in the same week because Tyler had reorganized project management structures around what he called creative responsiveness, which apparently meant nobody knew who approved what anymore. One pharmaceutical client suspended all pending campaign launches until an independent audit could be completed. For $0.1 million frozen. Then came the staffing collapse. Lena resigned first. Not dramatically. She simply emailed notice at 8:03 a.m. on a Tuesday after Tyler publicly blamed her media team for a budget overrun he'd personally approved during a golf dinner. Marcus followed 48 hours later. Sophie lasted another week. Each resignation hit harder than the last because smart employees weren't leaving emotionally anymore. They were leaving methodically. Clients noticed that. One client asked directly whether Hawthorne was experiencing leadership instability. That's corporate language for this place feels unsafe. Meanwhile, Mercer's stratagem kept growing quietly. Not explosively. Carefully. I took 3 mid-sized clients during my first month. Regional retail. Healthcare consulting. A manufacturing company whose former CMO had worked with me years earlier. Nothing flashy. Just stable business built on reputation. Then something happened I genuinely didn't expect. People started reaching out not because they wanted revenge on Hawthorne. Because they wanted relief. Marcus came by my office one Friday evening carrying coffee and looking like he'd slept inside an airport terminal. You hiring yet? He asked. Maybe. I'll take less money. No, you won't. That made him laugh. Then he got serious. I forgot work wasn't supposed to feel like surviving a hostage situation. A week later, Sophie joined. Then Lena. One by one. Not recruited. Drawn. That's the part executives never understand when they talk about loyalty like it's ownership. Talented people don't stay where they're respected least. By the 6th week, Mercer's stratagem had 7 employees, including me. 6 of them came from Hawthorne. Richard apparently took that personally. Good. He should have. Because every departure represented years of institutional knowledge walking out his front door voluntarily. Then came the public disaster. The one nobody could hide. Hawthorne was pitching for the renewal of its largest remaining account, Norvale Consumer Health. $22 million annual billing. The presentation took place in a downtown hotel ballroom because clients love paying agencies to perform confidence theatrically in neutral carpeting. Richard led the pitch personally. Tyler handled strategy. God help them both. I heard about it from 3 different people before noon. Apparently, Tyler opened the presentation by referring to Norvale's core customer demographic as aging legacy consumers. The client base was primarily women over 50. Excellent start. Then Richard presented expansion projections using outdated market assumptions pulled from an old beacon export Marcus had built nearly a year earlier. Except the numbers no longer matched current reporting models. Norvale's CFO noticed immediately. Again. Executives who control tens of millions of dollars tend to notice when numbers stop making sense. The meeting deteriorated from there. Tyler contradicted finance forecasts twice. Richard interrupted one of Norvale's senior directors mid-question to explain modern consumer fluidity. At some point, the presentation deck malfunctioned because nobody had embedded the video assets correctly. Marcus later told me one of the Norvale executives finally closed her notebook halfway through and said, "I don't understand who's actually operating this agency anymore." 3 days later, Norvale terminated the renewal process. Just like that. $22 million walked away. That was the moment the board stopped treating Richard like Martinvale's son and started treating him like a liability. The emergency meeting happened the following Monday. I know because Melissa called me afterward from her car. Not the office. Her car. People speak more honestly in parking garages. They're considering removing him from operational oversight, she said quietly. Operational oversight of what? Everything. Rain tapped against her windshield while she talked. The board hired external auditors Friday night. Finance found undocumented overrides in campaign forecasting. Legal discovered compliance gaps tied to Tyler's restructuring decisions. Not one problem. A chain reaction. Exactly as predicted. Melissa lowered her voice further. Dana, they want you back. I watched traffic moving below my office window. Doing what? Running the agency. There it was. Not advisory. Not transitional. Reality. I said nothing for several seconds. Then. And Richard. Long pause. He's still CEO technically. She hesitated. But the board's requiring executive supervision on all operational decisions now. Meaning he'd been stripped without being formally removed. Which, honestly, was probably worse for him. Melissa exhaled shakily. They need someone clients trust. No. They needed someone employees trusted. Clients were just the symptom. The breaking point came 48 hours later. One of Hawthorne's pharmaceutical accounts received a compliance inquiry from federal regulators regarding improperly archived campaign approval records during Tyler's restructuring changes. Nothing criminal, but serious enough to trigger immediate review. The client threatened suspension pending investigation. Another $9 million at risk. That finally did it. At 6:22 p.m. on Wednesday, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Richard. It was Martin Vale. Retired founder. 72 years old. Still sounded like gravel and bourbon. Dana. Martin. I should have called sooner. Probably. He didn't waste time pretending otherwise. I let my son confuse inheritance with competence. There it was. The first honest sentence anyone from Hawthorne leadership had spoken since this started. Martin continued. The board wants you back. I want you back. Frankly, half the clients are asking for you by name. I stayed quiet. Then he said something that surprised me. You built more of that company than my son ever understood. Not praise. Recognition. Different thing entirely. What are you offering? I asked. Martin gave a short, tired laugh. Whatever it takes. So I told him. Carefully. No emotion. Just terms. I wanted full operational authority as Chief Strategy and Operations Officer. Not shared authority. Not collaborative oversight. Full control. Base compensation, $640,000 annually plus equity participation tied to recovery performance. 3 times my previous salary. I wanted independent authority over staffing, workflow systems, and client retention structures. No executive overrides without documented board approval. Then the important part. I want written accountability findings from the board review, I said. Internal distribution mandatory. Martin went quiet. There it was. The condition they wouldn't like. Because money is easy for corporations. Accountability terrifies them. That's going to create problems, he said carefully. Yes. You really need that piece? I do. Silence stretched. Then. Why? I thought about conference room ash. Plateaued. Fresh energy. Because men like Richard survive by rewriting history faster than everyone else. Not this time. Because if you don't document what failed, I said calmly, you'll hire the next Tyler in 6 months. Long silence. Then Martin sighed. Fair point. I continued. I also want every employee who resigned under Tyler offered reinstatement with salary increases and written apologies. Martin actually laughed once at that. Not mockingly. Almost approvingly. Still protecting your people. That's the job. We finalized terms 2 days later. Richard resisted the accountability report until the very end. Of course he did. The board overruled him. Of course they did. My first morning back at Hawthorne felt strangely quiet. Not triumphant. Just focused. The elevator opened onto the 14th floor at 7:11 a.m. Same gray carpeting. Same burnt coffee smell drifting from the kitchenette. But the energy had changed completely. People looked relieved. Not because I was special. Because uncertainty is exhausting, and somebody had finally walked in who understood where the exits were during a fire. Marcus stood near analytics holding a coffee cup. "You came back," he said. "Apparently." He smiled for the first time in weeks. Sophie actually hugged me briefly before seeming embarrassed she'd done it. Lena walked over from media planning and said, "Please tell me Tyler's gone." I glanced toward the executive offices. "Not gone. That's disappointing. He reports to me now." That landed exactly the way you'd expect. By 9 a.m., every department head was in conference room ash. Same room. Same aggressive air conditioning. Interesting symmetry. Only this time I sat at the head of the table. Richard sat halfway down the left side, looking like a man attending his own performance review. Tyler wouldn't meet my eyes at all. I opened the meeting simply. "We're going to stabilize operations first. Branding changes stop immediately. No campaign restructuring without compliance review. Beacon access returns to original forecasting protocols effective today." Nobody argued. Of course they didn't. The board representative sitting in the corner made sure of that. Then I looked directly at Tyler. "You're removed from approval authority pending retraining." His face flushed instantly. "I think that's an overcorrection." I held his stare calmly. "You referred to women over 50 as legacy consumers in front of a $22 million client." Silence. Then Marcus coughed suddenly into his hand to hide a laugh. Tyler looked toward Richard for support. Richard stared at the table. That was the exact moment everyone in the room understood the hierarchy had changed permanently. The recovery took months. Real recoveries always do. We rebuilt client trust one conversation at a time. Repaired compliance structures. Restored staffing ratios. Reinstated escalation systems Tyler had dismantled because he thought process looked old-fashioned. Turns out clients enjoy old-fashioned when it prevents lawsuits. 6 months later, Hawthorne was stable again. Not perfect. Stable. Important distinction. I officially held the title Chief Strategy and Operations Officer. Marcus became Executive Director of Analytics with a 35% salary increase and actual hiring authority. Lena took over Integrated Media Operations. Sophie led brand messaging across all consumer accounts and won an industry award for a healthcare campaign she'd nearly quit advertising over. Mercer Stratagem still existed too. That was part of the agreement. My consultancy remained independent under a long-term strategic partnership arrangement with Hawthorne. Another condition Richard hated. Another condition the board approved anyway. The accountability report circulated internally 3 months after my return. 37 pages. Dry language. Audit summaries. Leadership failures. Documentation gaps. Unauthorized forecasting overrides. Compliance exposure tied directly to Tyler's restructuring initiatives and executive oversight failures. No theatrics. Just facts. Those are usually worse. Richard remained CEO technically. But only technically. The board created operational review committees requiring documented approval chains for major decisions. Strategic planning moved through my office first. Tyler stayed another 4 months before accepting a consulting opportunity somewhere in Denver. Translation: the board paid him to leave quietly. Honestly, good for him. Some people need consequences more than humiliation. The total financial damage from those 11 weeks ended up around $31.4 million between lost accounts, recovery costs, delayed contracts, legal audits, and staffing turnover. $31 million because one executive confused youth with capability. Personally, my life got smaller in the best possible way. Less performative. Less exhausting. I stopped checking emails at midnight. Started having dinner with my sister regularly again. Bought decent coffee instead of drinking whatever burned sludge accumulated in conference rooms. One evening after work, Sophie and Lena came by my office carrying takeout containers and cheap wine in paper cups because technically alcohol still wasn't allowed on the floor. Marcus walked in 20 minutes later complaining about forecasting requests from finance. Normal things. Healthy things. At some point Sophie looked around my office and laughed softly. "What?" She pointed toward the window. "You know this office is bigger than Richard's now." I looked around. She was right. I hadn't even noticed. Funny what stops mattering once you no longer need to prove you're valuable to people determined not to see it. Sometimes I still think about that Friday morning in conference room ash. The burnt coffee smell. The air conditioning too cold for no reason. Richard telling me I'd peaked. The strange thing is, he was partially right. I had peaked there. At the version of my career where I kept protecting people who underestimated me because stability felt safer than change. Leaving forced everyone, including me, to find out what my work was actually worth once it wasn't quietly holding the walls together in the background. And the answer turned out to be considerably more expensive than Richard expected. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the people holding a company together usually aren't the ones talking the most in meetings.